Elara knew she was out, the second her sister slipped into the ceremonial cloak. Rain dripped off the archway, hitting the welts on her back where the elders had roughhoused her into the clearing. Her bare feet sank into the cold mud. All around her, the pack was circled up tight, smelling less like a wedding crowd and more like people waiting for a fight to break out. Across the fire, the Alpha took her sister's hand. He didn't even look Elara's way. So much for 3 years of promises in the dark. As the pack erupted into cheers, something inside her chest lurched hard enough to make her dizzy. It wasn't heartbreak. It was heat. She pressed her freezing hands against her ribs, trying to shove the sensation back down. "Stay asleep," she told it. If that thing woke up with half the pack standing here, she wouldn't make it to the tree line. Then the cheering died out. Out in the dark beyond the perimeter gates, a horn blew. It wasn't the frantic sharp blast of a guard raising an alarm. It was slow and deliberate. Someone announcing they'd just crossed the border and didn't care who knew it. Even the Alpha turned his back on the ceremony to face the gates. Chapter 1. I, Alpha Thorn, reject you, Elara, as my mate and Luna. The bonfire circle went dead quiet. Hundreds of pack members stared at Elara, at her frayed hem, at the dried mud caking her cheap shoes. Then Thorn reached out and took her sister's hand instead. Maya smiled. It was a sharp, ugly look, though for a fraction of a second, something like panic flickered behind her eyes. Elara didn't understand why her sister would look terrified after just being handed the entire territory, but there was no time to process it. Thorn laughed, a low rumble like grinding stones. "Did you really think I'd bond with an Omega?" he said. "Take her back to the dirt, where she belongs." Nobody stepped forward. Thorn wanted a fighter at his side to secure his borders, not a servant, so he took Maya. When the crowd started laughing, a growl vibrated deep in Elara's chest. It wasn't the thin, frightened whine of an Omega. It was heavy and old, the sound of something massive waking up under her ribs. She closed her eyes and remembered her mother's hands gripping her shoulders in the dark woods 10 years ago. "Hide the gold in your eyes, Elara," she had whispered, her breath smelling of fear and pine. "If they ever see what you actually are, they'll skin you alive." The golden wolf inside her wanted blood. It clawed at her throat, demanding she tear Thorn open right there in the dirt. But if she let it out, his guards would kill her before she reached the tree line. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, swallowed the growl, and dropped her head. Then she turned her back on the fire, on Thorn and on her sister, and walked toward the servant shacks alone. The music from the celebration followed her down the dirt path. By the time Elara pushed open the warped door of her cabin, her hands were shaking so hard she could barely latch it behind her. The room smelled like dry rot and old wool. The floorboards were drafty, letting in the autumn wind, but she ignored the cold and went straight for the rusted wash basin. She twisted the handle until freezing water sputtered into the bowl, plunged her hands in, and grabbed a block of lye soap. She scrubbed until her knuckles rubbed raw. When she looked up into the cracked mirror over the sink, her reflection looked like a ghost with a bruised jaw, a souvenir from the head enforcer the morning before. Then her eyes shifted. A bright, unnatural ring of gold bled into her brown pupils. She gripped the metal basin until the plumbing rattled. Push it down. She remembered when Thorn first noticed her 3 years ago. She dropped a tray of glasses in the dining hall. He dragged her into the kitchen by her braid and told the cooks she was a stain on his floor. She'd spent 3 years letting him think he broke her that night. But right now, the magic buzzing under her skin felt less like a curse and more like a live wire waiting for a puddle. She couldn't stay here. If she stayed, she'd kill someone, and then they'd hang her. She pulled a canvas rucksack from under the bed and stuffed in a torn wool blanket, 2 apples she'd smuggled from the pantry, and a dull boning knife. She was reaching for the door latch when the air in the cabin went thick. The temperature plummeted. A draft blew through the floorboards, carrying a scent that had nothing to do with roasting elk or pine needles. It smelled like copper and ozone, the sharp tang of fresh blood mixed with wet earth after a thunderstorm. Underneath that was something dark and heavy, like night-blooming jasmine. Her wolf lunged against her ribs before she even recognized what the smell meant. The stronghold's warning horns blew, a long, agonizing blare that rattled the glass in the window frame. Seconds later, the cheering from the bonfire turned into screaming. Elara dropped her bag, stepped to the window, and rubbed a clear patch through the grime on the glass. Black smoke was already billowing up over the tree line. The main gates were on fire. The Obsidian Pack had breached the perimeter. The outcasts from the northern cliffs everyone assumed would stay freezing in the mountains until winter starved them out. Rumor was they were led by Thorn's older brother, Kalen. The story said he was unstable, that he used blood magic to keep his pack alive, and that he tore through border guards without bothering to shift into his wolf form. Out in the courtyard, the screaming spiked, and that scent, rain on dry dirt, copper, jasmine, hit her lungs so hard she felt dizzy. It was coming from the center of the fighting. Her wolf didn't care about the raiding party or the burning gates. She was pacing Elara's chest, pawing at the inside of her ribs, wanting to run straight out into the bloodbath, to find whatever was producing that smell. Elara fought her back down and retreated from the window. She slid onto her stomach and wriggled under the low frame of her cot, pressing her cheek against the cold floorboards. Heavy boots thumped down the dirt path outside. Doors were being kicked off their hinges further down the row of servant shacks. They were clearing the rooms. She held her breath. Her door didn't just open. It shattered inward, the rusted latch tearing straight out of the doorframe. A shadow blotted out the light from the burning courtyard. The smell of wet earth and blood flooded the cramped room until she could taste it on the back of her tongue. From under the bed, all she could see were massive steel-toed boots, caked in thick black mud and fresh blood. The boots stopped in the middle of the room. The man exhaled, a heavy ragged sound, and then a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. "I know you're in here," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel scraping over iron. Inside her chest, the golden beast did the worst possible thing. She let out a soft, needy whimper. The blood-caked boots pivoted slowly toward the bed. The mud-caked boots stopped inches from Elara's face. A hand clamped onto the wooden frame of her bed. With a deafening crack, the man ripped the heavy pine structure away and tossed it aside like kindling. Dust rained down. Elara lay exposed on the bare floorboards, knees pulled to her chest, waiting for the killing blow. When she finally forced her eyes open, her lungs seized. He was coated in the blood of her pack's elite guards. She should have screamed. Instead, she was paralyzed by his eyes, obsidian black, swirling with a volatile, untethered violence. But the second his gaze found hers, the frantic madness stalled. The scent of petrichor and crushed jasmine flooded her senses. The realization hit her hard enough to make her dizzy. Mate. The exiled warlord of the Obsidian Pack, the beast rumored to slaughter alphas for sport, was her fated mate. Kalen dropped to his knees in the dirt. He reached a trembling, blood-stained hand toward her face. Nobody had ever looked at her like she was something worth keeping. Deep in her chest, her inner wolf let out a thrumming purr. She reached back. She couldn't help it. She traced the brutal raised scars on his knuckles, feeling the unnatural, feverish heat radiating from his skin. There he is! 3 of Thorn's largest enforcers burst through the ruined doorway. They raised heavy crossbows, the silver tips glinting in the firelight. Kalen moved instantly, stepping over Elara to shield her with his massive frame. A low growl vibrated through the floorboards, just as the bowstring snapped. The arrow hit with a sickening, wet thud. Kalen choked out a rough grunt. A silver shaft protruded directly from his shoulder blade. Silver should have stopped his heart on contact. Instead, the warlord roared and lunged. Elara scrambled backward until her spine hit the wall. Kalen didn't even shift. He fought in his human skin, moving too fast to track. It was a messy, bloody collision of snapping bone and tearing flesh. 10 seconds later, the 3 enforcers lay motionless on the splintered floorboards. Outside, the shouting spiked. Heavy boots pounded down the dirt path. Thorn's guards were clearing the sector, and Thorn would gladly burn his own stronghold to the ground to ensure his brother died inside it. Kalen turned back to her, chest heaving. Dark blood dripped from his jaw. He shoved his hand out again. "Come with me," he rasped. Elara flashed back to a winter when she was 7. She'd tried to nurse a half-frozen stray dog behind the kitchens. Thorn found it and snapped its neck, just to teach her a lesson about keeping useless things around. If she stayed in this room, Thorn wouldn't just kill her, he'd make it hurt. She didn't hesitate. She pressed her hand into his blood-soaked palm, and his fingers clamped around hers like a vice. They ran. The wind bit at Elara's face, mixing with the blistering heat of the burning gates behind them. Kaelin dragged her through the dark tree line. Despite the silver arrow still buried in his back, he didn't slow down, vaulting over fallen logs and tearing through the dense brush. By the time they hit the muddy banks of the territorial river, Elara was gasping for air. The mate bond hummed beneath her skin, a frantic electric current pulling her toward the man beside her. Without a word, Kaelin scooped her up. She buried her face in his chest, focusing on the deafening, steady pound of his heart as he plunged directly into the freezing rapids. Her mother used to tell her the Outcast lands were a graveyard for good wolves. But right now, clinging to a rumored monster in freezing water, she felt completely safe. Halfway across, she peeked over his wide shoulder. High up on the stronghold's stone balcony, framed by the orange light of the fires, stood Thorn and Maya. Maya was pointing furiously at the water. Thorn gripped something glowing and red in his fist. "Elara," Kaelin whispered. It barely carried over the roar of the rapids. His boots hit the mud on the opposite bank. They were in the Outcast lands. She had survived the night, but as the bond pulsed hot against her ribs, she knew the war had just started. The iron gates of the obsidian fortress loomed out of the dark. The jagged stone walls scraped against the night sky, looking less like a sanctuary and more like a scar. Elara braced herself for a damp cell and a chain. Instead, Kaelin carried her straight past the sentries. He didn't stop until they reached a massive chamber deep inside the keep. A fire was already cracking in the hearth. The room smelled like dry cedar and old ash. He set her down. Without a word, he reached over his shoulder, gripped the bloody shaft of the silver arrow, and tore it cleanly out of his back. Thick blood splattered the flagstones. He didn't flinch, though his breathing grew shallow and ragged. "You're safe here," he said. The low gravel in his voice was gone, hollowed out by pure exhaustion. He stepped out into the corridor and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The lock clicked firmly into place. Trapped, but warm, Elara crawled onto the fur-covered mattress and let her trembling legs give out. 10 minutes later, a raw, agonizing scream tore up from the courtyard. Elara scrambled off the mattress and pressed her face against the cold glass of the window. Down in the dimly lit training yard, Kaelin was on his hands and knees. He was thrashing in the dirt, fingers digging deep gouges into the packed sand. In the moonlight, thick pitch-black veins spider-webbed up his neck and down his forearms. The sharp tang of ozone and scorched blood drifted up through the drafty window frame. The magic he'd used to tear through Thorn's guards wasn't free. The toll was actively burning his nervous system apart. He hadn't just risked an execution squad to save her. He'd swallowed this blistering agony to make sure she survived the crossing. Her golden wolf whined, pacing hard against her ribs. Elara pressed both hands flat against the glass, her heart hammering in her throat. She wanted to run down there. She wanted to put her hands on him and draw the violent heat out of his skin. But the door was locked. All she could do was stand in the cold and watch the monster tear himself apart. Morning came with a heavy scrape at the door. The lock turned, and Kaelin pushed the wood open. He looked completely gutted. His skin had a waxy pallor, and the broad shoulders that had effortlessly carried her through the woods now slumped. "Food," he muttered, turning to lead her down the winding stairwell. She kept her eyes glued to the floorboards, an ingrained Omega reflex, as they entered the main hall. It reeked of roasting meat, stale ale, and wet dog. The long tables were packed with heavily scarred outcasts. The second Elara walked in, the hall went dead silent. Then a vicious snarl erupted near the front table. 2 massive warriors knocked over their chairs, drawing iron blades as a dominance dispute boiled over. Kaelin stepped forward to break it up, but his boot caught on the uneven floor. He stumbled. His muscles were still fried from the toxic magic. A white-hot spike of anger flared behind Elara's ribs. These were his men, in his hall, and they were disrespecting him while he was barely standing. She didn't think. She just stepped directly in front of the warlord. "Stop." It wasn't a shout. It was a heavy, physical vibration that rattled the wooden tankards on the tables. The air in the room instantly thickened, crashing down on the crowd like physical weight. The two brawlers froze. They dropped their iron blades and collapsed to their knees, bowing their heads so violently, their chins struck their chests. The hall was perfectly still. Elara stared down at her own shaking hands. Behind her, Kaelin let out a ragged breath. When she turned around, his obsidian eyes were wide, staring at the blazing gold, bleeding into her irises. The royal bloodline was out. Training started before sunrise, and Kaelin didn't pull his punches. Elara hit the dirt hard enough to drive the wind out of her lungs. Before she could roll over, his boot hooked her ankle and dragged her back into the open. She spat a mouthful of dry weeds and tasted blood where her teeth had clipped her lip. She dragged herself up. Back at the stronghold, Omegas were ignored until someone needed a floor scrubbed or a face to hit. Kaelin paced through the morning fog, sweating and breathing through his teeth, watching her stance instead of the bruises forming on her arms. He lunged again. This time, Elara didn't drop her arms to block. She stepped inside his reach, caught his forearm, and used his forward momentum to twist her hips and throw her weight backward. They hit the ground together. Kaelin grunted as his shoulders slammed into the root-veined dirt. Before he could leverage his weight, she threw her leg over his hip and pinned him, her chest heaving against his. The fight drained out of the clearing. Kaelin lay still beneath her, his chest rising and falling in quick, heavy shifts. The amber flecks in his eyes bled out, leaving his pupils wide and black. He reached up, his calloused palm gripping her hip to steady her. "Better," he rasped. As he tilted his head back to catch his breath, the pale morning light caught a thick, jagged scar running from his collarbone up the side of his neck. It looked like an old silver burn, but as his thumb brushed her skin, the silvery tissue flushed with a faint, rhythmic heat. Before she could ask about it, a scream cut through the tree line. A scout stumbled out of the brush, clutching his throat. Blood spilled between his fingers as he collapsed into the dirt, an arrow shaft protruding from his neck. 5 men dropped from the lower branches of the oaks, dressed in the black leather of Thorn's elite guard. Kaelin grabbed Elara by the tunic and hurled her behind the thick trunk of a redwood, just as blades cleared their sheaths. The guards swarmed him. Kaelin didn't shift. He caught the first man by the wrist, forcing the blade downward until the bone snapped, but 2 more clamped onto his shoulders. He was moving slower than usual. The blood magic from the river crossing still weighed on his nervous system. The squad leader circled behind the scuffle, drawing a hunting knife coated in a slick, greenish oil. Wolfsbane. He lunged, aiming straight for the gap in Kaelin's leather armor near his spine. Elara stepped out from the trees. A low, vibrating hum started behind her ribs. The mental dam she had spent 10 years reinforcing simply broke. A wave of kinetic force exploded outward from her skin. The air in the clearing thickened instantly, turning heavy as lead. The shockwave hit the squad leader mid-stride, hurling him backward into a tree trunk. His poisoned knife spun away into the brush. The remaining guards dropped their weapons, falling to their knees as the sudden atmospheric pressure crushed their equilibrium. They looked up, caught the blinding gold light bleeding out of Elara's irises, and scrambled backward. A second later, they were breaking through the underbrush. The war room smelled of melted tallow and damp stone. Heavy tactical maps covered the table, held flat by iron weights. A single red marker sat squarely over Thorn's stronghold across the river. Kaelin leaned against the masonry, pressing a linen rag to a shallow cut across his forearm. He didn't look at the map. His eyes stayed on Elara. "They saw," Kaelin said. His voice was flat. "Thorn knows what you are now. He'll empty the barracks and burn down half the territory to find you." Elara remembered hiding in a freezing culvert with her mother when she was 7, listening to the hunting horns echo through the pines. "Kings don't share their thrones," her mother had told her, her hands shaking in the dark. She had been right. Thorn took the territory by slaughtering her father, and he would never stop hunting the only bloodline that could legally challenge his claim. Running had never worked. It just gave Thorn a smaller target to chase. The magic hummed steadily under her skin, warm and solid. Elara looked down at the red marker on the map, then up at Kaelin's scarred face. "Let him send them," she said. Her voice was steady. "I'm done running." Kaelin slowly lowered the rag from his arm. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silence in the room thickening, before his jaw tightened and he gave a single, definitive nod. Elara stood outside Kaelin's door for a long time before she touched the latch. The room smelled like pine and rain. Kaelin was standing by the open window, staring out into the dark. He turned sharply when the wood creaked, his eyes locking onto hers. In her old pack, looking an Alphard in the eye was a good way to get your jaw broken. But Kaelin didn't look at her like she was an Omega. He crossed the floor until he was standing right in front of her, reaching up to run his rough thumb along her jawline. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "I want to be here." Her voice shook a little, but she didn't step away. Instead, she reached up, caught the thick fabric of his shirt, and pulled him down. He groaned, a low, rough sound, and kissed her. It was heavy and desperate, tasting like iron and storm air. Her fingers tangled in his hair as his arms came around her waist, lifting her entirely off the floor. He carried her to the bed and laid her back into the furs. The mate bond flared hot under her skin, pulling taut. He leaned over her, his mouth trailing down her neck until he stopped over her pulse. "Mine," he growled against her throat. She tilted her head back. His fangs broke the skin. There was a sharp pinch of pain, then a hot rush of warmth that flooded her veins, sealing the bond shut. Outside the stone window, something small and dark flickered across the rooftop ledge. A bird, maybe, or a shadow. But Kaelin pulled her closer, and Elara forgot to look again. Sunlight hit her face. Elara woke up tangled in wool blankets, Kaelin's heavy arm thrown over her waist. He was still asleep. In the daylight, he looked like a different person. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and the tight, painful tension in his jaw was gone. The magic from their mate bond was already filtering out the rot of the blood magic, absorbing the poison before it could burn out his nerves. He just looked like a man who had finally gotten some rest. She touched the fresh mark on his neck, a matching scar to the one on her shoulder. She thought about the tiny, folded portrait of her father her mother had kept hidden inside the lining of an old coat. "Your father was a good king," she used to whisper. No wonder Thorn had hunted them down so viciously. He was sitting on a stolen chair, and Elara was the only one left who could legally kick him out of it. A sharp tap against the glass broke the silence. Elara carefully slid out from under Kaelin's arm, wrapping a fur throw around her shoulders as her bare feet hit the cold stone. A massive raven was sitting on the windowsill, tapping its beak against the pane. A strip of black paper was tied around its leg. Thorn's bird. She unlatched the window. The bird let out a harsh croak as she untied the ribbon, then immediately launched itself back into the gray sky. She unrolled the note. Thorn's jagged handwriting bled through the paper. "I have your sister. She told me everything about your little trap. She hangs from the courtyard gates at midnight. Surrender yourself, or watch Maya rot." Something small and silver dropped out of the paper, bouncing off the floorboards with a clear ping. Maya's favorite ring. Elara's stomach dropped. It was a trap. Kaelin would see it was a trap the second he looked at it. But the clock had started ticking toward midnight anyway. Elara stared at the ring on the floor, her pulse drumming in her ears. Maya had sold her out. Her sister had stood on that stage, taken her mate, and probably handed Thorn the floor plans for the invasion. But she was still her sister. Elara couldn't sit in a warm bed while Maya choked on a rope for her. Her wolf whined in her chest, a low, unhappy sound. The beast knew what she was about to do, and hated every second of it. She looked over her shoulder. Kaelin shifted in the furs, breathing deeply. If she woke him, he wouldn't even argue. He would pull his swords, rally his battered outcasts, and march them straight into whatever silver-plated meat grinder Thorn had set up at the border. He would get himself killed, just to keep her from hurting. She couldn't let him pay for her family's mess. She dressed quickly, pulling on her boots in the dark. Every scrape of leather sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Her chest ached so badly, she could hardly swallow. She walked to the desk, picked up a stick of charcoal, and scribbled across a blank scrap of paper. I love you. Don't follow me. This is my fight. I will come back to you as a queen, or I won't come back at all. She left the note on his pillow, leaned down and brushed her lips against his cheek. He didn't stir. She slipped out the oak door and hurried down the dark stairwell. The morning shift was changing at the gatehouse, a 2-minute gap where the sentries looked away. She squeezed through the iron gate and ran out into the freezing woods, heading straight back to the hell she had just crawled out of. Elara reached the tree line of Thorn's territory with her lungs burning. The courtyard gate stood wide open in the pouring rain. A single rope hung from the center arch, swinging back and forth in the wind. Nobody was waiting for her. No executioner, and definitely no sister. She had walked straight into a trap. A hunting horn blew from the walls above. The iron gates slammed shut, the latch dropping with a heavy, final thud. Dozens of Thorn's guards stepped out from the shadows around the perimeter, raising crossbows. The tips of the bolts glinted silver in the gray light. Then a roar cut through the rain. Elara looked up. Kaelin was standing on the high stone parapet. He hadn't stayed behind in the firs. He had tracked her scent all the way back. "No!" she screamed. "Kaelin, run!" He didn't run. He vaulted off the ledge and hit the mud right in front of her. He snarled at the guards, fangs out, his eyes black and murderous. The guards didn't shoot. Instead, 4 of them hurled heavy nets, woven from silver wire. The metal weights crashed down over Kaelin's shoulders. Elara lunged to pull the netting off, but the silver seared her palms the second she touched it. Kaelin hit his knees, choking out a rough grunt as the wire burned through his clothes and into his skin. She threw herself over him, trying to shield his neck with her own body. It wasn't enough. 2 guards grabbed her by the hair and hauled her backward through the mud. She kicked and bit at their leather armor, but they dragged her toward the keep, while Kaelin bled out in the rain. They threw her onto the floor of a damp cell. Heavy silver shackles were already waiting. A guard clamped them around her wrists, and the poison hit her bloodstream instantly. Her inner wolf went silent, the golden heat in her veins snuffed out like a candle. Footsteps clicked on the stone stairs outside. Maya stepped up to the cell door. She wasn't wearing a dirty prisoner shift. She was wearing an expensive silk dress, her hair pinned up under a gold Luna crown. "You look terrible," Maya said. She was smiling. Elara dragged herself up against the damp wall. "You wrote the letter." "Of course I did," Maya said, running a finger along the iron bars. "Thorn needed the warlord dead, and I needed you gone. You really thought I'd let you ruin this for me?" Elara just stared at her. She had spent 10 years trying to keep her sister safe, and Maya had traded her away for a title without blinking. "Where's Kaelin?" Elara's voice was a rough rasp. Maya's smile widened. "Thorn's finishing him off in the yard. You're going to die down here by yourself, Elara." She turned and walked back up the stairs, leaving the door at the top open just enough to let the sound of the rain drift down. The night dragged on. The floor was freezing, and the smell of mildew and wet dirt made it hard to draw a full breath. With her magic suppressed by the silver cuffs, the mate bond felt like a severed nerve. There was no warmth on the other end of it, just a dull, hollow ache. She pulled her knees to her chest and waited. Hours later, the heavy door at the top of the stairs banged against the wall. Thorn came down the steps dragging something heavy behind him. He looked completely untouched, no blood on his tunic, no marks on his hands. He stopped outside the bars and dumped a body onto the cell floor. It was Kaelin. His hair was matted with dried blood. Deep claw marks crisscrossed his chest, and his skin was a pale, waxy gray. He wasn't moving. "He took longer than I expected," Thorn said, wiping his palms on a rag. "I'll let him finish bleeding out, then I'll come back for you." He locked the cell door and walked away. Elara crawled across the floor, the silver chains cutting deep into her raw wrists, until she reached him. She pulled his head into her lap. His skin was ice cold. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking as tears dropped onto his jaw. "Don't leave me here, please." She sat in the dark holding him, waiting for his chest to stop moving entirely. Then his fingers twitched against the stone. His hand slid forward an inch. His cold fingers found her wrist and squeezed, a weak, deliberate pressure against her pulse. Kaelin's bloody fingers tightened around her wrist. Elara leaned over him, her breath catching at the wet, ragged rattle in his chest. He forced his eyes open. The obsidian black was gone, replaced by a blinding, solid white light that bled down his neck and into the veins of his forearms. He reached up and closed his bare hand around the silver chain binding her wrists. The metal sizzled instantly. The smell of burning flesh filled the cramped cell as the silver seared into his palm. "Stop," she choked out. He didn't let go. The thick silver links glowed cherry red, warping under the sudden heat, and snapped. The cuffs hit the stone. Kaelin immediately slumped backward, unconscious. The second the silver left her skin, the magic hit her veins like a physical blow. Elara pressed both hands flat against Kaelin's ruined chest. His heartbeat was a faint, irregular flutter under her palms. She pushed the golden heat from her own pulse downward, forcing it into his chest cavity. The torn skin beneath her fingers knit rapidly together, sealing over the deep claw marks. Kaelin took a sharp, desperate gasp of air and bolted upright. His eyes were clear, the white light gone. He stared at her, taking in the blazing gold of her irises, but there was no time to explain. She stood up, walked to the cell door, and wrapped her bare hands around the iron bars. The metal groaned, heating under her grip, and bent outward until the lock mechanism shattered and the door swung open. They took the spiral stairs fast. Kaelin stayed close behind her, silent and weaponless. Near the top landing, 3 dungeon guards rounded the corner. They drew their swords, one of them opening his mouth to shout in alarm. Elara didn't break her stride. She stepped into the center of the corridor and let the mental dam completely break. The air in the stairwell thickened to the density of water. The golden shockwave hit the guards before they could swing. They dropped their steel and collapsed, clutching their throats as the sheer pressure of the royal aura crushed the oxygen out of the space. Elara stepped over them. At the top of the stairs, heavy oak doors sealed off the main hall. Muffled music and the clinking of glasses bleed through the wood. Thorn was celebrating. Elara placed her palms flat against the heavy oak. Elara pushed the heavy oak doors open. The music cut out. Hundreds of guests turned toward the entrance, staring at her torn tunic, the dried blood on her arms, and the bright gold bleeding into her irises. Thorn was lounging on the carved throne with a glass of wine. When he saw her, his hand twitched. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the flagstones, dark wine spilling like blood across the gray stone. Maya stepped out from behind the throne, her face going dead pale. Elara walked into the center of the hall. With every step, the air density in the room shifted. The pressure built, growing so thick and heavy, it pressed against the crowd's chests like physical weight. "Guards!" Thorn shouted, jumping to his feet, his face reddening. "Kill them, now!" Nobody moved. The atmospheric weight of the royal aura pinned the sentries where they stood. They couldn't raise their crossbows or draw their steel. They just stared at her, struggling to draw a clean breath. "This ends tonight, Thorn," she said. Thorn didn't answer. He shifted mid-stride into a massive gray wolf, launching himself off the dais with his jaws aimed straight at her throat. Elara didn't step back. She let the mental dam collapse entirely. A wall of kinetic pressure hit the beast mid-air. Thorn slammed into the stone floor with a sickening thud, skidding across the tiles until he stopped inches from her boots. She held him down with the sheer weight of her will, forcing the gray wolf belly down against the floorboards, crushing his alpha authority until he stopped thrashing and whined. Around the perimeter of the room, pack members slowly dropped to their knees. The hall went dead quiet. Elara looked past Thorn's trembling wolf form and found Kaelin standing a few paces behind her. He looked battered, his clothes torn from the silver netting, but his eyes were steady. He walked past the kneeling elites, his heavy boots clicking against the tiles. When he reached her, he didn't look out over the crowd to gloat. He dropped onto one knee and bowed his head. "My queen," he rasped. Near the entrance, his surviving outcasts knelt with him, submitting their exiled pack to her claim. Elara reached out and touched Kaelin's cheek. His skin was cold and rough. She pushed a steady pulse of her own warmth into him, letting the ambient strength of the room wash over the bond. Under her palm, the rigid, painful tension left his jaw. The erratic white light in his veins faded out completely, leaving his eyes clear and dark. "You're free," she whispered. Her voice cracked. She took his hand and pulled his massive frame back up to his feet. "You're my equal, Kaelin," she said, projecting her voice so the entire hall could hear her claim him as king. He didn't care about the audience. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her against his chest, kissing her hard in front of the throne. The storm broke before dawn, leaving the valley damp and green under the morning sun. Elara stood on the high balcony overlooking the river. The air smelled like pine needles and wet earth. She turned Maya's silver ring over in her fingers, one last time, before flicking it over the ledge, watching it disappear into the white water below. Maya was already gone, escorted to the southern border by guards at sunrise, with orders never to cross back. Heavy footsteps sounded behind her, before Taelin's chest pressed against her back. He wrapped his arms around her shoulders and rested his chin on her hair. She leaned back against him, looking down into the courtyard. It was a mess. The gates were charred, the courtyard was torn up from the fighting, and outcasts and stronghold elites were eyeing each other from opposite sides of the yard with tense, lingering suspicion. "We did it," she said, her fingers intertwining with his calloused hand. Kaelin let out a low, rumbling laugh against her neck. "You did it," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her bare shoulder. Nothing was fixed yet. There were ruined borders to rebuild, a fractured territory to feed, and decades of bad blood to settle before this place ever felt like a real home. But as she turned her head to catch his lips, the golden wolf inside her rested quiet and steady.